all situated? Okay, good. Thank you. Well, let's see. I want to read today from Matthew's Gospel in chapter 11, starting with verse 1. Matthew chapter 11, verse 1. And the question we want to ask, or the subject we want to address is, since this being the Christmas season, or leading up to it, we should probably talk about why it was necessary, or what was the purpose, or why did Jesus come into the world. At Christmas time it's typical to celebrate with a little scene of the stable and the little baby in the manger and so forth. But that part of it, while that's an interesting and important part of the story, that's not really the big picture. That's not really the most important thing. The most important thing to consider is why. Why did Jesus come into the world? Why was it necessary? What was the intent? What was the purpose? And so today we're going to look at this aspect of it from Matthew chapter 11. And the point we want to make is Jesus came to show and reveal what God is really like, the true nature of God, the true personality of God as reflected in himself. And he's got some really interesting things to say in this chapter, so we're just going to start in the very first verse and see what we can discover here. This is Matthew chapter 11, starting with verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass, when Jesus had made an end of commanding the 12 disciples, he departed thence to teach and to preach in their cities. Now when John," that is to say John the Baptist, "had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples, and said unto him, Art thou he that should come, or do we look for another?" Now we can sort of read between the lines here. John the Baptist was, of course, the forerunner of Jesus, and announced his coming, and in fact baptized him in the River Jordan, and said some important things introducing Jesus to the world. And John has now been arrested and thrown into prison. If you know the story, I think it's a pretty common story. He had said something about Herod and Herod's new wife, and he said it was not lawful for him to have his brother's wife, and that made her mad, and she manipulated circumstances to have John the Baptist arrested. And so John is in prison now. And evidently, reading between the lines, we might assume that John asking this question of his disciples to go to Jesus and say, "Are you the one that should come, or do we look for another?" We might read between the lines and say he perhaps himself was discouraged, but on the other hand, he's thinking, this isn't quite what I expected, of the Messiah, of the one that I was announcing. We don't really know exactly what his disappointment was or what his expectation was, but he sent some disciples. He went at least to the trouble to have 2 of his disciples go to Jesus and say, "Are you the one that should come, or do we look for another?" So Jesus gave him this answer in verse 4 to John's representatives. He answered and said unto them, "Go and show John again those things which you hear and see." Why did he say that, by the way? Well, he said, go and show John, and remind him what it is that you hear and see me doing. Verse 5 says, "The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Now, he's saying that because, as though to say, this is what I'm doing. This is what the true heart of God is. Now, reading between the lines, we might have expected what John was thinking was Jesus was going to come, the Messiah, and sort of with force or with some kind of, a political movement or some kind of power, overthrow the government of Herod and install what he imagined might be, and others did too, the kingdom of God, and things would be in a big dramatic way. But instead, Jesus, as God's representative, is saying that's not really how God is working. He's not here to overthrow Herod. He said he's here to restore the sight to the blind, to restore their physical abilities of those who are lame, to preach the gospel. In other words, to give benefits, favor, grace, and healing to individuals, to change the lives of individuals. And we can read all those things in verse 5 that he describes. So he says, go tell John what I'm doing. And as though to consider, this is really what God is all about. Verse 6, he says, blessed is he whomsoever shall not be offended in me. Now I looked up this word offended. He's talking about John. I looked up the word offended, and it's a Greek word that's translated offended here called scandalizo. And you can tell just from the sound of that, it's where we get our English word scandal, or scandalize. It's scandalizo is the Greek word. And it literally means to trip or to fall, metaphorically. And here's a quote now from Strong's Concordance: to cause a person to begin to distrust or desert one whom he ought to trust and obey. That's literally what this word means. To scandalize, in other words. So he's saying, just remind John, don't be offended, don't trip and fall, don't change your attitude because of misunderstanding of what I'm doing. Blessed is he who's not offended or scandalized because of me. And then he departed, verse 7, or as they departed. Jesus began to say to the multitude concerning John. He's going to take this opportunity to talk about John the Baptist. And he says in verse 7, what went you out in the wilderness to see? Meaning John. A reed shaken with the wind? Verse 8 says, but what went you out for to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? Behold, they that wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. John was known for being kind of rough. Verse 9, but what went you out for to see? A prophet? Yea, I say unto you, and more than a prophet. Verse 10 says, for this is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before my face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. That is a quote from the Old Testament, from Malachi. I think we read this a few weeks ago. Malachi predicted that before the day of the Lord, before the coming of the Lord, he would send a messenger. And he called him Elijah. He said, I will send Elijah to you. And Jesus is saying this is what the prophets predicted that would come. Verse 11 says, verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Verse 12 says, and from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. Now we need to stop and talk about that verse for a minute, just so you understand what it's saying. Because we live in a day and in a time when there are preachers that run around and take that verse out of the context and try to make it say that Christians should be violent. That's not at all what he's saying. When he says the kingdom of heaven suffereth violent and the violent take it by force, he does not mean Christians should engage in violence of any kind. What he's saying is that up until now the kingdom of heaven has been suffering violence. And in fact, violent people are taking God's representatives by force. Let me read it to you from another few translations so you get the idea in verse 12. This is from the NIV. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. Here's the Expanded Bible. Since the time of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subject to violence, suffering violent attacks, and violent people have been trying to take it by force and lay hold on it and attack it. The most pertinent one, I think this is the best one. This is from a translation called The Voice. Here's what it says. When John the Baptist came, the kingdom of heaven began to break in upon us, and those in power are trying to clamp down on it. Why do you think John's in jail? See, that's pretty good. In other words, what he's saying, he's addressing the fact that John the Baptist, God's messenger sent to introduce Christ, is sitting in Herod's jail. That's why he says the violent. In other words, John is who he's talking about. Why do you think John's in jail? Then he adds, verse 13, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. That's a way of saying that what you read in the Old Testament, all the prophets and the law, it all culminates in the coming of Christ. And John is the breaking point, or you might say, he represents the end of that old system of things. Now that's really an important thought that you need to consider and factor into your thinking. That means that there are no outstanding prophecies that are unfulfilled from the Old Testament, that they've all run their course, and they all are culminated in Christ. That's exactly what he's saying here. Let me read you that verse from a couple of other translations. The Contemporary English Version says, all the books of the prophets and the law of Moses told us what was going to happen up until the time of John. Here's the Phillips translation. But if you read the books of the prophets and God's law closely, you will see them culminate in John, teaming up with him and preparing the way for the Messiah of the kingdom. If you look at it in this way, John is the Elijah you've all been expecting to arrive and introduce the Messiah. Now, this is all really important because what he's suggesting here is what he came into the world to do is to bring something brand new. He's saying that everything that you know, now he's speaking in first century Israel, about what to them was simply their scriptures. What we call the Old Testament was to them their scriptures. He's saying it all culminates in this man, John the Baptist, who introduced me, and now I'm going to bring something new. He's saying that old system of things, to them is not old, it's their current system of things. But this is all coming to a culmination, and now I'm bringing something new. It's called the kingdom of heaven. Now we need to get that clear in our minds, that we are today living in what Jesus predicted would come, the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. It's not something for the future. The Old Testament and the law and the prophets and what for them was their scriptures has all reached its culmination in Christ. And now Jesus is saying, I'm here to bring something totally new, something brand new. Everything you read about in the Old Testament has reached its culmination in John. Verse 14, he makes plain what I just read from the Phillips translation. And if you will receive it, this is Elias. That's Elijah. The reason it says Elias is that's a Greek version of it. And in the days of Jesus, they used a Greek version of the Old Testament. And that's a really long story. It's called the Septuagint, why they had that at that time. But that's why you see Greek versions of these Old Testament prophets' names. If you will receive it, John, that is Elijah, which was for to come. Now, he says that because the last book in the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, makes a prediction. He says, I will send Elijah before the great day of the Lord, and he will turn the hearts of the parents to the children, lest I come and strike the land with a curse. It's a very harsh message of judgment. And again, this is, if you read honestly and read it fully, you find that that is a kind of a through line or a theme of the Old Testament prophets, that Israel was always getting into trouble. And generally speaking, the prophets had a very negative message and threatening them and warning them. And after Malachi says that, the prophets stop. And it all goes quiet. The telephone line goes dead. For 400 years, silence. No prophets, nobody speaking for God. Malachi had the last word. And then John the Baptist appears. And Jesus is saying, this is the one that Malachi predicted would come, preparing the way for the Messiah, for Jesus, who brings the reality of what God is. He is God manifest in the flesh. He is the one that can say, if you see me, you've seen the Father. So he says, this is Elijah. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. Whenever Jesus says that, whenever he says, he that hath ears to hear, let him hear, that's saying you have to consider. Things are not as they appear to be on the surface. So, he that hath ears to hear, let him hear. Verse 16. But whereunto shall I liken this generation? Let me pause there for just a second and say, here's a little clue or a little tip for Bible interpretation. Whenever Jesus says this generation, he means the one that is living at that time, contemporaneous with him. He never means our day. When he says this generation, he always means those people that were standing there in his presence listening to him. He uses that expression, I looked it up some 17 or 18 times in the Gospels, and every single time he means those people who were standing there in his presence listening to them. He calls them this generation. Now that's important because when you turn a few pages and get over to Matthew 24, he predicts a lot of things that were yet to come, and some Bible teachers mistakenly want to place that in our future. These are things, he said, all these things, this generation will not pass before all these things are fulfilled. And it's amazing to see the mental gymnastics that some people go through to try to make that mean some generation in our day. He didn't have anything to say about our day. He was talking about that generation, those people who were standing there in his presence. And as he predicted in Matthew 24, all those things were fulfilled within that generation. And that's how you have to understand it. So he says, do you understand what this means? When this expression, this generation, is used, it is linked to judgment. It is linked to what Malachi was predicting. The Messiah is here, and they've refused him and rejected him, and now they're going to be in trouble because of that. So he says, whereunto shall I liken this generation? It is like unto children sitting in the market, calling unto their fellows. Verse 17, and saying, we have piped unto you, but you have not danced. We have mourned unto you, and you have not lamented. What does he mean? Verse 18 says, for John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he hath a devil. In other words, John the Baptist came, and he lived an ascetic life. That means a life of extraordinary, extreme self-denial. He was fasting. He taught his disciples to fast. He was living a life of asceticism, and what they said about him was, he's crazy, or he has a devil, he says. That was John. But the Son of Man, that's Jesus, came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a man gluttonous and a winebibber, a friend of publicans and sinners, in verse 19. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a man gluttonous and a winebibber. And that is what they said. He socialized, he hung out with the publicans and the sinners. And evidently, well, if you're going to read between the lines here, they weren't there for a Bible study. But he associated with them, and they were touched by his life. He didn't consider, when he hung out with those people, they say glutton, that means eating, feasting, winebibber, that means they were drinking, and not just non-alcoholic grape juice either. That's why it says a winebibber. That means someone who is drinking alcohol. Let's just be blunt about it. He was hanging out with them. And so that offended the Pharisees. All this feasting and, we might say partying going on. But what Jesus said about it is, they that are well do not need the physician. That's what he meant by saying, they are being helped by my presence. Jesus did not consider that what was wrong with them was going to get on him and make him wrong. He considered that what he had would come out of him and touch their lives, and so it was. But he's saying, you didn't accept John. You said he had a devil and he was fasting all the time. And here I come hanging out with the publicans and sinners, and you say, oh, he's a friend of publicans and sinners, gluttonous, winebibber. So he said, you're not satisfied either way. Verse 20, and then he began to upbraid the cities wherein most of his mighty works were done, because they repented not. Verse 21, woe unto thee, Chorazin! Woe unto thee, Bethsaida. Now these were cities of territorial Israel in verse 21. Chorazin and Bethsaida are cities belonging to the nation of Israel. He said, if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, these were cities outside territorial Israel, so they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. In other words, they would have been touched by what I did. They would have been moved by what I did. They would have seen the works that I did and recognized them for what they were, the works of God. See, this all relates back to what those disciples of John said. Are you the one that should come, or do we look for another? Go tell him what you've seen. The lame walk, the dead are raised, the blind receive their sight. And he's saying if those things had been done in these cities outside of Israel, it would have touched them. They would have changed their mind. They would have accepted. But here in these cities of Israel, they rejected him. They ignored him. They were indifferent to him. In one case, in his own hometown, they drug him out of the synagogue and were going to throw him off the cliff because they didn't like what he had to say. But I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, which are another city of Israel, which are exalted unto heaven, you shall be brought down to hell, or Hades is the literal word. For if the mighty works which had been done in thee had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. Verse 24 says, But I say unto you that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for thee. Now why is that? Why is he being so hard on them? Well, these cities of Israel, they were in covenant with God. God had a covenant with the nation of Israel. You know, and why is he being so hard on them? Is it because he's mean or because he's angry? No, it's because they had a covenant with God. And you can read about it in Deuteronomy 28. There were blessings for fulfilling their part of the covenant, and there were a whole string of curses associated with it. And they did not fulfill their part of the covenant. Now, in our day, we don't have that covenant. We don't have you know who has a covenant with God? Jesus does. And we relate to God through Christ because we believe in him. He is the representative. You don't have a direct covenant with God. You don't have anything to uphold or to fulfill. Jesus is our representative, and he upholds and fulfills the human side of things. That's why the new covenant is so much greater and better. That's why what he's come to introduce is so much greater and better than what they were experiencing at the time. And he's saying you should have paid attention. You should have listened. You should have accepted what was happening and recognized it for what it was. Verse 25, let's go on reading. So he stops this little discussion that we've been reading, and he begins to pray a prayer out loud, letting everyone hear what he says. He says, I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and the prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. In other words, the big shots and the elites and the wise and the people in the temple and the priests and the Pharisees, the people who really think they're special, it's hidden from them. But the people who are understanding are the lowly, humble, the ordinary folk, like you and me, for instance. Verse 26 says, Even so, Father, for so it seemed good in thy sight. Verse 27 says, All things are delivered unto me of my Father. And no man knoweth the Son but the Father. And neither knoweth any man the Father, save the Son. And he to whomsoever the Son will reveal him. Now, do you get what he said in that verse? He says, nobody knows what God is really like except me. Nobody knows the Father except for the Son. And, not just that, he to whomsoever he shall reveal him. He's saying, I know what God is really like. I know his true nature, his true personality, his true character, and I have come to reveal it to anyone who will listen to me. And that's why he was upbraiding and criticizing those cities, because they ignored him, because they were indifferent to him. But the publicans and the sinners and the down and outers and the lowly, humble people, they listened to what he said and believed what he said. So he says, I've come to show you what God is. Nobody knows what God's like except me. And I've come to reveal him, to show. whosoever the Son will reveal him. And then right away, he gives this beautiful passage that we sometimes read without all that other beforehand, but now we understand the context a little better. He's come to reveal the true personality and nature of God. Verse 28 says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Now this is Jesus speaking, but he's speaking as a representative of God and saying, this is what God is like. You have burdens, you have heavy weights in your life. Come to me and I'll give you rest. I'll give you relief. This also relates back to what he said to the disciples of John when he said, go tell John what you see. The lame walk, the dead are raised, the blind receive their sight, the poor have the gospel preached to them. He said, I'm taking people's burdens away. I'm taking their oppression off of them. So I will give you rest. Verse 29 says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me. A yoke is something that joins two things together. In verse 29, a yoke joins two animals together for agriculture or for other things. A yoke, that's what it symbolizes, is joining together. So he's saying, join together with me, or plug in, or get hooked up with me. Come into a relationship with me. And learn of me. That means both learn from me and learn about me. Learn of me. And here's what you're going to find out. And you see, he says, I've come to show you what the personality of God is really like. He says, I am meek and lowly in heart, not a proud, cruel, harsh, hateful taskmaster, but sympathetic. God is sympathetic. I'm sympathetic. I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Not stress, not anxiety, not difficulty, not a bunch of duties and burdens and obligations. You will find rest for your souls. The part of you on the inside, the part of you that's subject to anxiety and worry and concern. He said, I'll give you peace. I'll give you rest. And here's why. Verse 30 says, my yoke is easy. My burden is light. That's Jesus talking as a representative of God. The yoke, remember, represents our relationship with him, joining of two together. He says it's easy. I've told this before. I had a young man here. Of course, I was younger then too, so both of us. Anyway, he was upset with me for what I was preaching. He thought I was leading people astray, and he's saying, you're just trying to make it easy for people. He wanted to make it hard. See, he thought I was letting people off the hook. He said, you're just making it easy for people. And so I quoted this verse to him. I said, listen, it's not my idea. It's not me making it easy. Jesus is the one who said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And I think the problem is, if people find the Christian life difficult or hard, maybe they got yoked up to something other than Jesus. Because he says, my yoke is easy. He says, my burden is light. You know, he didn't say, get yoked up to a program or a doctrine or a church even. You know, the only reason for church is so we can direct our attention to Jesus. The only reason for a minister is to call your attention to Jesus. The church points at Jesus. That's our legitimate function. The minister, his legitimate function is only one thing, to point you to Jesus, because that's where all the help comes from. He's here to help, he says. No, so if he says, I've come to reveal the true nature of God and what God is really like, for those who have ears to hear, for those who want to hear, for those who are open to it, well, so what did he reveal about God, about his true nature, through his ministry and through what he did? Well, we've already read a lot about it. I wanted to take a look at just two other examples. This is in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. This is an example of the true nature of God. Luke chapter 9, starting with verse 51. And let's see if I can find it here. Luke chapter 9, verse 51. Came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up, meaning he's at the end of his ministry, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. Now that means he's on his way to Jerusalem because he knows the time has come when his ministry is to be fulfilled. And he sent forerunners to go and make arrangements. That is to say, he sent people to prepare a place where they could eat and a place where they could stay, maybe an inn or lodgings. That's what this is all about. So when Jesus and his disciples got there, it would make things easier for them. They wouldn't have to go and hunt for a Motel 6 or something like that. They were going to go, well, probably they would stay in a better place than that. No, I shouldn't say it. There's nothing wrong with Motel 6. You can judge all that for yourself. In other words, he sent these messengers to prepare lodging and food for him and his disciples. But verse 53 says, they did not receive him because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. Now, the reason they did not receive him is because he was on his way to Jerusalem. And there was this hostility and conflict and antagonism between the Samaritans and the Jews. They didn't like each other. And it goes way back into Jewish history to the time just after Solomon when the kingdom broke apart. The tribes separated, 10 on one side, 2 on the other. And the northern kingdom set up a rival temple in the city of Samaria. And in the south, they had the original temple, Solomon's temple, in Jerusalem. And so there's this religious hostility, and also there's a racial kind of component to it. The Jews consider the Samaritans to be half-breeds, sort of. They had intermarried with people of the land, and the Jews were, in their eyes, more pure racially. So there was a lot of friction between these two groups. So here they come, Jesus and his disciples, and they find out they're on the way to Jerusalem, and they say, no, we can't stay here, which is kind of mean, kind of a bad thing to do. And so when the disciples found out about it, well, they were, understandably upset. Verse 54 said, when the disciples, James and John, now these later in the book of Acts are going to be the leaders of the church, but at this time they're just the disciples. But they got really, really mad about this. That's my translation. Really, really mad. When James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we should command fire to come down from heaven and consume them even as Elias? That's Elijah, like we were talking about before. Even as Elijah did. And that's true. They're quoting a biblical precedent from the Old Testament. When the king of Samaria got sick, he sent messengers to Beelzebub in Ekron, and he said, go and inquire at Ekron of Beelzebub whether I'll get well or not. And when Elijah got word of this from the Lord sent Elijah to these messengers of the king, and he said, go turn back and tell the king, it's because there's no God in Israel that you send messengers to Beelzebub. And so when the king of Samaria saw the messengers come back, he said, what are you doing back here? And they said, well, we met this man. He said, go back and tell the king. And they told him what he said. And they said, what did he look like? He said, well, he was a hairy man. That's what they said. He was a hairy man, kind of a rough individual. And the king said, yep, I know who it is. It's Elijah. And so the king said, well, I'll show you. We see what Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. This is an example of that. This king said, I'll show you who's got the power around here, Elijah. And so he got a captain of 50 soldiers, and he sent him, go take this guy, this single prophet. So there's Elijah sitting on top of a hill, and these 50 soldiers come up and said, the king says, come down, come with us. And Elijah said, well, I got something to say to you. This is my translation. I got something to say in return. If I'm a prophet, let fire come down from heaven and burn you all up. And you know what? Fire came down from heaven, burned them all up. Well, that made an impression. But not enough, because the king said, let's send 50 more and try it again. Maybe that was a fluke. So he sent 50 more, and they tried it again. Same thing happened. Elijah says, if I'm a prophet, let's see fire come down from, and God, he respected Elijah's word, and fire came down, burned them all up. It's pretty harsh, And so the king said, well, to a new captain, you go this time. Well, this man, he was a little more polite. He saw what had happened to those other guys. He says, please, Elijah, So he didn't burn the last guy up. But anyway, that's what the That's what the disciples are talking about. They're saying, Jesus, remember that story about Elijah and he called down the fire from heaven and so forth? He says, let's do that to these people who wouldn't give us a room, wouldn't give us lodgings. In their imagination, I'm thinking they probably imagined this is really going to be great. You know, we're going to call down fire. Jesus is going to call down fire from heaven and show these people what's up, you know, show who he really is. But you know what? Jesus, that's not really the true nature of God. Now that did happen in the Old Testament, but we see in the Old Testament a distorted impression of God, distorted by unresolved sin between man on one side, breaking the connection between God on the other side. And sin calls for judgment. And so it was appropriate that judgment came. But you know what Jesus came to do? He came to go to the cross and carry all the sins of humanity and take the judgment on himself. So Jesus is saying, in effect, you know, we're in a new situation now. I'm here now. I've come, and I'm bringing something totally new. He responded to his disciples, verse 55, and he rebuked them. He didn't just say, no, I don't think we'll do that today. He rebuked them. He said, you know not what manner of spirit you are of, implying that you've got it all, you are in the totally wrong spirit of things. Verse 56 says this, for the Son of Man has not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And he went to another village. Now that's an important thought. See, we're in a new situation. We're not in the world of the Old Testament. We're in a new situation. We're in a new world. The sin issue has been resolved. There is no need or call for judgment because Jesus has taken the judgment. This is important. Things that happen in the world are not God's judgment. There's a lot of things that can happen in the world. You need to understand that the attitude of God is, I have not come to destroy men's lives. I haven't come to make it worse. I've come to save, not to destroy. And this is a good picture, a good revelation of what the true nature and personality of God is. Here's another one. I like this one too. This is in John's Gospel. And it's chapter 8. John chapter 8. This is a very familiar story. Really, all these are. But we're asking the question, why did Jesus come into the world? Well, it was necessary. Jesus came into the world to reveal or to show what God is really like through himself. John chapter 8, verse 1. Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came into him, and he sat down and taught them. Now, this was his practice, to reveal. You see, he said, no one knows what the Father is like except for the Son, and to whomsoever he shall reveal him. So he's teaching to reveal what God is like. But the scribes and the Pharisees, they didn't like it very much, and they didn't go to hear what he had to say. When they interacted with him, were there to criticize or to try to trip him up or to try to trap him in his words. And so here they're doing that in verse 3. The scribes and the Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. Now this raises lots of questions in my mind. Where do you come up with this? Where do you find this situation? Well, you know, it doesn't tell us, but we'll take him at their word. They bring in him this woman who's guilty, taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. This is a little bit like the disciples who said, do you want us to do what Elijah did and call down fire from heaven? In other words, we read in the law these certain things. Let's do it. Let's put it into practice. So Moses in the law says someone guilty of adultery should be stoned. What do you say? Well, verse 6 says, this they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. So they were tempting him, hoping he would say, well, don't listen to Moses. But he doesn't say that. Here's what he did say. Nothing. He said, but Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. Lots of questions, lots of controversy, lots of theories about why he did this and what he was doing in the ground. To me, I think this is a sign of he did this as a symbol of disrespect and of repugnance at what they were doing. It's just a way of saying, I don't want to have anything to do with you. So you come with this nasty situation here and call on this woman to be stoned. He just got down like I don't even want to deal with you. I don't even want to hear what you're saying. He's just ignoring them. And he's doodling around in the dirt as a way of showing, this is what I think of you and your ways and your question. And so he just wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. I think he's just drawing little circles and, just drawing little figures on the ground just to show that he is not interested or listening to what they had to say. But they kept at him. In verse 7 it says, they continued to ask him. He finally lifted himself up and said, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. Then he stooped down and wrote in the ground. He went back to what he was doing. So he didn't contradict Moses. Moses is right. The wages of sin is death. Sin calls for judgment. But he's saying, who's going to execute this judgment? Is it you? You know what he's saying? He's saying, you're no better than she is. He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. Paul does the same thing in Romans. In chapter 1, he lists a lot of very negative things, a lot of sins, a lot of very negative stuff. And then he says in chapter 2, therefore you are without excuse, whosoever you are that judges, because you do the same things. In other words, you're not worthy. You can't execute this judgment. He stooped down on the ground and wrote, and he didn't have anything more to say to them. And when they heard it, they were convicted by their own conscience. That means their own conscience told them, yeah, you're right, I'm not perfect either. So should I be stoned? I don't want to be stoned. So nobody picked up a stone. And they all left, it said, beginning with the eldest. I guess that's because they had the most to remember. Unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Now here's a woman. She's guilty. There's no doubt about it. There's nothing in the text that says she's not guilty, not falsely accused, legitimately guilty. And she's standing there alone in the presence of Jesus, the representative of God, the one who came to show what God is really like, what his personality is really like. Verse 10, when Jesus lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? Verse 11, she said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said to her, let's pause for a minute and consider, this is Jesus, the spokesman of God, the representative of God, the one who said, I have come to reveal what God is like. He's the only one there who is worthy to execute the judgment. He's without sin. He could have passed judgment on her. He could have. So he is there standing in the place of God. He could have executed the judgment. She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. This is a lot like what he said to the disciples. The Son of Man has not come to execute judgment, has not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. I think this is a good picture of what God's personality is like, what his nature is. So we could say in this Christmas season, when we ask ourselves the question, why did Jesus come? Why did he come into the world? He came to reveal what the nature of God was really like, what the nature of the Father really was. He's sympathetic. He is kind. He is humble. He is not a harsh, mean, hostile judge, but one who refuses to execute the judgment, who wants to save people's lives rather than bring misery and destruction to them. He's all about saving. He's all about reconciliation and making things right and not making things worse. Okay, I think that's all we got today. I see that Ethan is here. There he is.